Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Pond's mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman. And together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You'll find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at doingsofdoyle.com on Blue Sky. Hello and welcome to episode 61. Today we return to Baker Street, or should that be Montague Street, for another memoir of Sherlock Holmes, this time The Adventure of the Musgrave Ritual from 1893. And here's Paul to set the scene.
Whilst tidying his papers in the Baker Street flat, Sherlock Holmes unearths some relics of one of his earliest pre-Watson cases concerning mysterious and sinister events at Hurlstone Manor, the ancestral Sussex home of the Musgraves. His client and old university associate, Reginald Musgrave, hires the nascent detective Holmes to investigate the recent disappearances of Hurlstone's butler and one of the housemaids. It is quite clear, however, that this is no elopement, and central to the mystery is the old family catechism, known as the Musgrave Ritual.
Now, the Musgrave Ritual was the sixth of the second series of Sherlock Holmes short stories, the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, which were serialised in the Strand between December 1892 and December 1893. And we previously discussed the writing of that series when we looked at the adventure of the resident patient back in episode 18. But very briefly, the first series, The Adventures, had been so successful that even before the series had finished publication in the Strand, the editor, Herbert Greenhouse-Smith, agreed to pay £1,000 for 12 new short stories. Conan Doyle began writing them in June 1892, just after completing his great Waterloo novel, The Great Shadow, which we covered in episode 48. And then he got to work straight away on the first three memoirs, shortly before disappearing off to Norway on a family holiday. On his return, he wrote the next three, which included the Musgrave Ritual, and were submitted towards the end of October 1892. And while the memoirs were for Conan Doyle very much a second series of short stories, readers of the Strand magazine could be forgiven for thinking that this was a continuation, because the stories in the memoirs were numbered consecutively, and so the Musgrave Ritual was actually number 18 in the series. But for all it is a continuation, you do get a sense that Conan Doyle was starting to play a bit with the format here. The previous story in the series had been The Gloria Scott, which had dipped into an early non-Watson case. And this would be the theme again for the Musgrave Ritual. Plus, we get a bit more insight into Holmes's past and his private life. One of the peculiar features about this story, though, is that this is not the first time that we hear that there is a case called The Adventure of the Musgrave Ritual. In the original Strand serialised version of The Adventure of the Yellow Face, which came out in February 1893, Watson talks about Holmes having occasional failures and says, "I have notes of some half-dozen cases of the kind of which The Adventure of the Musgrave Ritual and that which I am now about to recount are the two which present the strongest features of interest." Now, by the time that the Yellow Face was included in the memoirs, the Musgrave Ritual had been written, and Conan Doyle changed the entry in the Yellow Face to read instead The Affair of the Second Stain. So this is a good example of Conan Doyle perhaps having the title before he had the plot. The Musgrave Ritual then first appeared in the Strand in May 1893 and was collected in the memoirs, which came out in December of the same year. And it generally got very good reviews in the newspapers. One of the very nice ones, though, was in the Westminster Gazette in December 1893 on the publication of the memoirs, where the reviewer had this to say about the memoirs in general. There is nothing in fiction quite like this gentleman detective with his shrewd observation of minute details, his knowledge of human nature, his astonishing faculty for deduction, the nimbleness of his wits, his quiet, resourceful way of undermining his adversary. Then, again, the problems themselves have a neatness and precision which appeals to the mathematical side of a man. Take, for instance, the story of the Musgrave Ritual. What a nice problem it is, how prettily and ingeniously worked out. And Conan Doyle himself felt fondly about this story in 1927 when he was asked to list his 12 favourite Sherlock Holmes stories. The Musgrave Ritual appeared as number 11. And it's a perennial favourite with fans as well. Back in 1999, a reader poll conducted for the Baker Street Journal placed the Musgrave Ritual as 6th out of all of the short stories. So a very, very popular story. And I'm sure in the course of this podcast, we'll be discussing why we think this is one of the more popular of the entries in the canon.
Part of the reason I think with this popularity, I mean, we will discuss more about this as we go on, but just it is the fact that the story is put together so well. It's a classic treasure hunt story as well, which is always going to be popular. Doyle himself, grew up loving a lot of these stories. Is the obvious one that leaps straight to mind, obviously Treasure Island, the Rob Louis Stevenson, but the main influence I would say on this is going to be his old friend Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
And kind of two stories in particular, which is The Gold Bug and The Cask of Amontillado. And the Gold Bug is it's kind of in a way the daddy of all modern treasure hunting stories. Where it's Captain Kidd's treasure that they're after in this, and there's a code left which has to be broken, and when the code is broken, you get a kind of an odd jumbled sort of rigmarole of a clue. Which goes, a good glass in the bishop's hostel in the Devil's Seat, 41 degrees and 13 minutes, northeast and by north. Main branch, 7th limb, east side. Shoot out from the left eye of the Death's Head. A beeline from the tree through the shot, 50 feet out. Which is almost as difficult to decipher as the code itself.
Yes.
But it's obviously it is worked out by the characters and is referencing a certain location. It's just brilliantly played out. But it stuck with Doyle, as with so many readers of this story, and he reworked it, as we'll see, in the Musgrave Ritual, and then the other aspect, which we'll come on to later, with Poe's favourite theme of premature burial,
yes,
which comes up in this story, and we'll probably discuss this story in more detail as the show goes on, but definitely with the idea of the revenge tale, the Cask of Amontillado, definitely comes to play a part in this. But Doyle was certainly he got those two examples, I'm quite sure. Yeah, and there may also have been other kind of not quite such good stories, possibly influencing that were more current, certainly than the Gold Bug.
Yeah. There's one, probably the most interesting in that respect, is a play called The Four-Leaved Shamrock by C.J. Hamilton, which actually appeared in Beaton's Christmas Annual 1887. So it appeared in the same volume as A Study in Scarlet, and that has a dishonest butler who finds a cryptic message, except it's not very cryptic at all. And on the basis of that, he discovers that there is hidden treasure in a building. He dies before he can take control of it. And in fact, it's left to a young heiress to then discover the treasure later. There's another story as well by our old podcast friend, Henry Rider Haggard, called Colonel Quaritch, which is about a Stuart royalist who hides treasures, and eventually that's discovered through coded messages in a family Bible. The one that's probably the most interesting is one that Roger Lancelin Green alerted people to in 1959, which is called Sefton's Servant. It was published anonymously in the Cornhill in March 1890, but is actually by a chap called Stanley Weyman. And it concerns the treasure, a Stuart treasure again, this time raised for Bonnie Prince Charlie, which is stowed away in a decaying manor house, and the secret to the location of the treasure is hidden in a book, which is discovered by the butler, who again dies while trying to excavate it, and it is eventually discovered by his son, who's the valet in the house. Now, with all these examples, what I would say is that the shorthand version of it makes the Musgrave Ritual sound much more plagiaristic than it actually is, because while they have components, when you read these things, they feel very, very different. And Sefton's Servant in particular is, a 30-page story that you could comfortably compress into about, 10. And the last 2 pages are really the description of the kind of plot mechanics that you could imagine Conan Doyle picking up and running with. So I kind of went into reading those thinking, oh dear, is this going to be a slam dunk case of plagiarism here on part of Conan Doyle? It really doesn't feel like it when you read these stories again. And that's partly because of the kind of artistry of Conan Doyle. Actually, he's able to turn these things into a really great adventure treasure hunt of a story, which has a lot more kind of skill and panache and charm to it than any of the 3 things that I've mentioned here.
And also, I mean, you could say that to a degree with the Poe as well. I mean, the Goldbug is a fantastic story, but Poe does have this tendency to long-windedness.
Yes.
To slow the story down.
Yeah, that's true.
In the midst of all the cleverness of how the clues are assembled, how the clues are put together to lead you on the treasure hunt, and Doyle just races through this stuff. And just sweeps you along with the story far more. I mean, this obviously the greatest example with Poe is Marie Roget, where it's more of an essay than a story, and not a particularly interesting essay at that.
No. There is that. There is that. But I think the artistry itself is best evidenced by the ritual itself, which is a terrific piece of writing, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It's something that just makes it lift off the page. It's why it's still, it is still said at every Baker Street Irregulars dinner every January as a call and response with the audience. So we might as well do it for you here and now. So here you go. Whose was it?
His who is gone.
Who shall have it?
He who will come.
What was the month?
The 6th from the 1st.
Where was the sun?
Over the oak.
Where was the shadow?
Under the elm.
How was it stepped?
North by 10 and by 10. East by 5 and by 5. South by 2 and by 2. West by 1 and by 1. And so under.
What shall we give for it?
All that is ours.
Why should we give it?
For the sake of the trust.
It's wonderful, isn't it? And it has such immediacy.
It's obviously looked at the Goldbug example,
yeah,
with the compass point directions and so on, but made a far more artistic catechism out of it all. Whereas Poe's comes across as a bit of a jumble.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And it's, you use the word catechism, and that's something that's important here, because it is,
absolutely.
It has an element of the kind of Catholic catechism about it as well. So people have also said that, it has a touch of Freemasonry about it too. And of course, Conan Doyle was a Freemason. Not at this time, not when he was writing this. He'd left the Portsmouth Lodge, and he would become a Freemason again, wouldn't he?
Yeah, and he knew that it is. I mean, one of the brilliances of this story is the title, The Musgrave Ritual.
Yeah,
I think that's another reason why it's successful, because it is a wonderful title, and Conan Doyle was steeped in this ritual because he'd been brought up by the Jesuits at Stonyhurst.
Yeah,
so he's regularly, daily in his school life, he's experienced ritual.
Yes.
And then, as you say, he joined the Masons. He was never a fully enthusiastic Mason, but he will have, again, I think the ritual element will have appealed to him.
Yes, I think so.
And I think he enjoyed this sort of thing, and that's why he makes such a really good job of writing up the ritual in this story.
Yeah. Yeah. It's worth saying as well that the ritual that appeared in the Strand magazine is different to the one that appears in the memoirs. So by the time it got to the memoirs, Conan Doyle had added another couplet. So the couplet, what was the month, the 6th from the 1st, was added later. And it's clearly Conan Doyle thinking, the clues don't necessarily work unless you have that piece of information. So he's decided to add it in the same way as at the same time of editing the memoirs, he goes back and fixes that reference in the yellow face to the Musgrave Ritual and changes it to the second stain instead. So, it's an interesting insight into how he works as well, I think.
But then I can't remember which one of the Sherlockians was it Bell or Christ? Got very clever and was talking about the change of calendar and so on.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
I think that's just going a bit too far, perhaps.
Yeah, Bell got a bit bit clever about that one, really. And it was actually our friend John Hall who pointed out that it probably isn't as complicated as that, really. No. But it's so immediately appealing, and that kind of call and response is something that we see in another setting, which is the famous play Murder in the Cathedral by T.S. Eliot. And it's worth saying maybe a few words about Eliot at this point, because Eliot was a big Sherlock Holmes fan and fan of crime fiction in general. When he came to write Murder in the Cathedral, which is about the death of Archbishop Thomas Becket in 1170, he has a call and response with the second tempter in the first act. And that goes, who shall have it? He who will come. What shall be the month, the last from the first? And he readily accepted at the time that this was, a direct lift or a nod to the Musgrave Ritual. And it wouldn't be the last time he would have a nod to Conan Doyle stories. His most famous is probably in Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, which was written 4 years later, in which Macavity the mystery cat is based on Moriarty. Macavity's a mystery cat. He's called the Hidden Paw, for he's the master criminal who can defy the law. He's the bafflement of Scotland Yard, the flying squad's despair, for when they reach the scene of crime, Macavity's not there. And at the end of the poem, he's referred to as the Napoleon of crime. So Eliot was really steeped in Conan Doyle and in Sherlock Holmes. He also really understood his crime fiction. There are a number of articles he wrote about crime fiction, which are well worth reading. He was a big fan of Dickens and Wilkie Collins in particular. He really cited The Moonstone as being the font of English mystery fiction. He also writes very fondly about Poe, although bizarrely the one he likes is Marie Roget, which we've just trounced. But he also he started to talk a lot about fair play in crime and detective fiction, a big theme of the sort of 20s and 30s, particularly 30s and 40s, I think, actually. And he was negative on what he called elaborate and bizarre machinery, which he said included codes, runes, and rituals. So you would have thought that would kind of put him on the opposite side of the fence to Conan Doyle on this one, but yet you find I think it's because of the kind of artistic quality of the ritual that you get it reused so readily in Murder in the Cathedral.
And well, you also got. I mean, you've read the first 4 lines, I think, from that, and it is just so clear. I mean, the whole thing goes on. What shall we give for it? Pretense of priestly power. Why should we give it? For the power and the glory. Yeah, it's so. I don't know if Eliot himself was probably surprised when people said, oh, this is plagiarism, because it's so obviously homage, because it's so obviously lifted. And in the end, I think it was just Nathan Bengis of New York wrote directly to him and asked him about it. And Eliot replied to him, said, my use of the Musgrave Ritual was deliberate and wholly conscious.
Yeah.
And I think he just assumed people would spot that, and it wouldn't be a problem because it is so clearly just a tip
Yeah,
of the
it
hat,
is.
not trying to use someone else's work.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Mm,
But it's amazing, isn't it? The number of people that you find were influenced by Conan Doyle and Conan Doyle's work, or
mm,
simply at the level of enjoying it so much that this becomes part of their writing in the future.
mm. And well, like Doyle himself. I mean, we've talked before that Doyle's genius, a lot of Doyle's genius, lay in synthesizing other materials
Mm.
and then making something original from that. And there's a lot to be said about this kind of uh, writers, writing by process in some ways of osmosis,
Yeah, that's right.
because that's just the way it is. That's the
Yeah.
way writers. It's usually accidental. It's very seldom, um, except in definite egregious cases, that it's a lift that is done for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think throughout this episode, we're going to keep coming back to why the Musgrave Ritual is such an influential and popular story. One of the reasons I think it is, though, is that we get such an insight into life in Baker Street in those opening few paragraphs. And it's amazing how much of the mythos of Sherlock Holmes is contained in those first couple of paragraphs. We get the cigars in the coal scuttle. We get the letters pinned by a jackknife, the Persian slipper of tobacco, the VR in the wall. We have Sherlock Holmes has been busy pasting entries into his commonplace book. We get a hint at the fact that he has these mood swings as well. And I think this is one of the things that, if you were to ask somebody about, what does Baker Street look like, you'd probably give them the first couple of paragraphs of the Musgrave Ritual, because it's so immediate and packed with character, isn't it? It's such a great opening sequence. And it was something that actually one of our correspondents on the socials, Mark Chatterton, pointed out, that it's this kind of thing that makes it so appealing.
Yeah, and it's as we've pointed out in previous podcasts. I mean, one of the things that I really enjoy about Conan Doyle's writing is his love of describing interiors.
Yeah,
And this is another one of the placing characters within their setting.
yeah.
It's something he's very good at. We get this with the narrator and the surgeon of Gaster Fell. We get this with Thaddeus Sholto is put into his room. It's showing you character.
Yeah.
Through this, and also with Holmes, you've got the additional thing of this is what Watson has to put up with.
Yes, indeed. Poor long-suffering Watson.
I think you make the point as well, Mark, that the VR is
the VR.
borrowed, or the shooting at the wall is borrowed from another of Conan Doyle's literary sources. And I feel you're right on this one.
Yeah, this is Pushkin, isn't it? This is so. It's interesting that when the Strand was kickstarting, it translated a lot of works into English, and one of them was Alexander Pushkin's The Pistol Shot, which does feature someone who is rather prone to indoor shooting and firing at the wall. And I wonder if that story itself might be influenced by a great story about Peter the Great. Peter the Great, when he was on his grand tour of Europe, came to London in the 1690s, and he, with his entourage of about 20 or 30 people, he trounced a building he was in. And one of the things that he was criticised for, apart from taking all of the furniture and setting fire to it so that they could be warm, and Peter the Great enjoying being pushed on a wheelbarrow through a 200-year-old box hedge, was the fact that he took pot shots at all the portraits in the building. But yeah, so I wonder if Pushkin's The Pistol Shot might be a reference, and that appeared in the Strand in February 1891. So it is something that will have been directly in front of Conan Doyle.
And the character is doing is terribly louche as well. He's got that kind of Holmesian loucheness about him, and and the idea that as well that the specific point that's made here is that Holmes is using a hair trigger. just how dangerous a person he
Oh
could
my
be in the
God.
house.
Yes. Well, I like the fact that somebody did the research that said that he was using boxer cartridges, I think it says.
Mm.
And they said, well, that would be a .32 caliber. Now, if it's a .32 caliber, that's not going to be leaving pockmarks in the wall. It's going to be destroying the wall.
Blowing the wall away.
So, maybe, the neighbors are going to be really upset by this. Apart from Mrs. Hudson.
Exactly.
Maybe Mr. Hudson, the estranged Mr. Hudson next door comes through and complains. Because there's not going to be much of that wall left. But you're right. What a dangerous companion. I love it. But then we get to this wonderful moment at the beginning where it's a wonderful moment because obviously Watson is saying, this room is an absolute pigsty. Will you please tidy it up? And Holmes, with, absolutely great insight into his understanding of Watson's character, brings out clearly a distraction for Watson, which is, yeah, but I've got all these great early cases. Wouldn't you like to know about these instead?
And we get a tantalizing list. And they're interesting to study in themselves, just to look at Doyle's playfulness here as well. And they're just great titles. The first one is The Tarleton Murders. And you start to look into this, and Tarleton is actually a village in West Lancashire.
It is.
And it's not far from Preston, therefore not far from Stonyhurst. So this is a name that Doyle's probably just picked up on. And very interestingly, just close to Tarleton is a hamlet called Holmes.
Oh, really?
So
I should know that because I'm from that part of the world. Gosh,
I don't think that's a deliberate touch on Doyle's part. I think it's just a lovely coincidence.
It's good, isn't it?
And the next case, Vanbury the wine merchant. The origins of this name, I would say, pretty clear. It's a fun reference to the Hungarian academic explorer and spy Arminius Vanbury, who was one of the great players of the great game in Central Asia against Russia, and he worked on the part of the British in that area. He also went on to he knew Bram Stoker.
I didn't know that.
Stoker actually mentions, he has a whole mini chapter on Arminius Vanbury in his memoirs of Henry Irving, because Vanbury went to the Lyceum Theatre, and Stoker may have got information from Vanbury, which then went into the historical background in Dracula. There is a school of thought that wonders, did Stoker get the name Dracula from Vanbury? I don't follow that one. I think he found it in Whitby, but nevertheless, it's perfectly plausible that he did get historical background and atmosphere from Vanbury. And there's a big clue in the story because Van Helsing refers to his friend Arminius of Budapest. So it's a little tip to Vanbury. So Arminius Vanbury is in Dracula and the Musgrave Ritual.
Wonderful.
Fantastic. Then there's another case, the Old Russian Woman. People often wonder, is this the Golden Pound Snake? But it can't be because it's pre-Watson.
Yeah, true.
So this is another old Russian woman that Holmes has encountered somewhere along the lines. The Singular Affair of the Aluminium Crutch.
Wonderful.
Which is
wonderful.
That in itself it's a fascinating title because aluminium crutches would not be common at this time at all. Most crutches would be the wooden underarm variety. And this, you just wonder, is this another kind of Sebastian Moran type hidden gun or something?
Well,
something like that, some kind of strange mechanism that's been...
Well, maybe there was more to that manufacture of artificial kneecaps in the Red-Headed League as well.
Yes. And then finally we get Ricoletti of the Clubfoot and his abominable wife.
Oh, that's brilliant.
There's plenty of speculation can go into that one, and there's also was this an early version of the later story, non-Holmes story, the Club-Footed Grocer.
Yeah, the Club-Footed Grocer,
which appeared in 1898.
Yeah.
We've got all of this. So no wonder Watson's drawn in and distracted from the mess and the bullet holes and everything else.
Well, I deeply hope that these are really, sort of Holmes's early stories, and that he wasn't just making up tantalizing titles on the spot to just, as long as Watson didn't say, "Oh, tell me more about this Ricoletti one." But it's brilliant, isn't it? Because this is one of the things that really makes Conan Doyle shine against his contemporaries. And we've said it before, when it comes to detective fiction in the 1890s, there's lots of really good plotters out there as well, but the characters tend to fall a bit thin, and this is great. This is great insight, not just into these kind of missing stories, but also the interaction between Holmes and Watson is really interesting too.
It's what Doyle has done with Holmes here, and remember, we're only into the beginning of the second series of stories at this point. He's built him to become a real character.
Yeah, he has.
Not just a grab bag of eccentricities.
Yeah,
there's far more psychological depth going on.
Yeah, and we get more about that character now, don't we? Because we get this great snapshot into Sherlock Holmes's life before he met Watson. And that's, we'd already had the previous story, The Gloria Scott, had been a reminiscence from before Watson's time. Here we have it again, but we get much more detail. We know that he's finished up at university. He has set up in rooms in Montague Street. He has far too much free time, and he spends it sort of studying. And you get... And it almost begs more questions than it answers. How is he able to afford this lifestyle, and what is he studying and where, etc. And so Montague Street's really significant because when Conan Doyle moved from Southsea to London, the family moved to Montague Place, 23 Montague Place, which is essentially the next street along from Montague Street. You go to the east end of Montague Place, turn right, and you're onto Montague Street, and that runs parallel to the side of the British Museum, which is also referenced here. So the Conan Doyles were there in sort of March, April, May, when Conan Doyle had his consulting rooms at Devonshire Place around the corner. And it is indeed right at the back of the British Museum these days. There's the Edward VII entrance at the back, which of course was not there at the time. And sadly, Montague Place doesn't exist anymore. It's pretty much the grounds of the University of London, the Senate House building, this enormous kind of slightly fascist building in the centre of London, which always gets used as a filming location for either arch capitalist buildings or fascist buildings. So I think it is Wayne Manor or Wayne Industries in the Michael Keaton movies, and it's also one of the fascist buildings in The Man in the High Castle. So that's pretty much on the spot there now as well. But of course, it would have been immediate walking distance British Library. And we've mused before about what else did Conan Doyle experience, when he was living here, because he did have a fair bit of time on his hands. And did he go at that time into the Egyptian collections, for example, and get inspired by those? So you have Montague Street, and then you have this little insight into Sherlock Holmes visiting the British Library. And I was there on Friday, actually, and I went into the reading room, and you see I was thinking, well, who else might he have sat alongside when he was in the reading room? And they have photographs of famous people who have used the reading room, including Sherlock Holmes. Though they do at least say on the photograph that he is fictional.
Speak it quietly.
That's right. But they if you think about the people who would have been there in the sort of 1870s and 80s, the most famous person almost certainly would have been Karl Marx. And there's that wonderful line in The Blue Carbuncle about Henry Baker spending his time in the British Museum, and you've always been that suspicion about, well, why was he hanging around there? Because he was not well-to-do, and he didn't have much money. He's down on his luck. And this British Museum at the time, British Library rather, at the time, was known as a kind of hotbed of radical thought, new thinking. So you have Karl Marx, you have others used it. Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde is a bit early for Oscar Wilde, I think, and same with Stoker.
Stoker is a kind of problematical one now, because although he has Jonathan Harker in Dracula saying that he spent time studying the maps and books in the reading room of the British Museum, we now know that Stoker actually got most of his books were the London Library.
So he wasn't there.
because these copies have been found in the London Library. And this idea of Stoker sitting in there, unfortunately, it doesn't mean he didn't go there, but certainly most of his Dracula research seems to have been done in the London Library, the other great
the
library
lending
for this
library
sort of thing. Yeah.
I mean, the other person I think would be just fascinating to think of Sherlock Holmes rubbing shoulders with is Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi arrived as a young lawyer in London in 1888. So again, it's later. If you're being strict with your H.W. Bell chronology, then this wouldn't fit. But Mahatma Gandhi used the reading room for a good 3 years. It's a lovely bit of insight into Sherlock Holmes' early life, and a snapshot of what life was like before he discovered his biographer.
And this again, this idea of the period of preparation is there with both the British Library and Bart's.
Yes.
So you see these two things together. The more theoretical side in the British Library, and then the more practical side in the laboratories at Bart's, and it just all begins to knit together very nicely.
There was a great piece of Sherlockian research by Michael Harrison and David Hammer both came to the same conclusion, which is that Sherlock Holmes lived at 26 Montague Street, and the reason they settle on 26 is because there are records that in 1875 the house was owned by Mrs. Holmes, so presumably a relative. There's a photo. I took a photograph of 26 Montague Street. I'm going to put it in the show notes. So we've set the scene of Sherlock Holmes living in Montague Street, and it's into the Montague Street room at one point that Reginald Musgrave, an old university friend of Sherlock Holmes, turns up with a mystery that he wants his old friend to solve. Musgrave himself is described as a scion of one of the very oldest families in the kingdom, but from a cadet branch of the Northern Musgraves that had settled in West Sussex in Hurlstone Manor. There's been a lot of debate as to where Holmes and Musgrave studied, whether it was Oxford or Cambridge or Camford. But there's certainly something to be said about the fact that this is alluding to the fact that they are both of from country squire stock. They're both of a certain status, even if Holmes is very much a kind of more junior member of that than Reginald Musgrave. But the name Musgrave itself is quite suggestive, isn't it? We think we've got a pretty good idea of where that comes from.
Yes, and I think this is what Conan Doyle's playing about with as well when he's talking about the Sussex Musgraves being a cadet branch of the Northern Musgraves, and I think this is Doyle in a way disguising his sources to an extent. The whole thing seems to come from Cumbria. And his mother, as we've discussed before, moved from Edinburgh to the Mason Gill estate of Brian Charles Waller in the mid 1880s. And this was in Cumbria. And the Musgrave family were actually from Westmoreland. And they were local kind of higher gentry, not aristocrats, but certainly big noises in the neighbourhood. And there's also near to Mason Gill, there's two villages, there's Great Musgrave and Little Musgrave. So the name that's going to be the origin of the name, and the fact we've got the Northern Musgraves specifically mentioned. It's all going into the mix, and it's I think again Doyle having a bit of fun. And perhaps poking a bit of gentle fun at Waller, who was again squirearchy himself. So I think there might be an element of that coming into play as well. That Waller's not quite up there with the Musgraves, but the Musgraves aren't up. This is a very class-ridden story.
It is.
And as you pointed out with Holmes, there's that element that Holmes is from the squirearchy himself. He's from the kind of the Waller's class.
Yes, he is.
There's obviously a degree of family money, but both Mycroft and Sherlock have to earn their keep. They haven't got enough. They haven't got enough private income
Yes, that's
to
right.
be able to live on that. So both have to go out and become professional men.
Yeah.
Whereas we know when Holmes meets up with Reggie Musgrave again, that Musgrave does have a job in terms of he's the local MP,
Yeah.
but he's still, he doesn't need that.
Yes.
At all. I mean, MPs at that time, it wasn't a living wage, like army officers. It wasn't, for people of their class, it wasn't a living wage that they were
Yeah.
getting anyway.
I mean, he does basically say, he inherited the status of MP, so which almost implies it's almost like a rock borough.
Yes.
But I mean, it's important. The class element is very important in this. It's been written about several times. I think David Leal and Mary Alcaro have both written quite a lot of stuff on this, and very good stuff too. Because in a way, Musgrave is the epitome of what was happening with the aristocracy in the kind of 1870s. 1870 is really the kind of peak of the landed aristocracy in Britain. It goes into a sort of steady decline thereafter, and it really accelerates with the First World War. But he's depicted as being somewhat, indolent, incurious, certainly incurious. He's not particularly smart. And yet you have Brunton, his butler, who is better known. He's the thing that people remember when they go to Musgrave Manor. He's smart, and as we discover in this story, he's almost a match for Sherlock Holmes. And so you get so you automatically get this sort of sense that maybe there's generations of inbreeding in the Musgraves has meant that they're slightly dense and don't quite know what's going on around them. And then in contrast to that, you've got Holmes, who is the epitome of the new professional class. Who's, he says at one point he's taken to living by his wits, which is precisely the opposite of what Musgrave is doing. Musgrave is living on his inheritance, as it were. So you get, I think there's a very strong class commentary that you can read into this story. That, like I say, David Leal, Mary Alcaro have written lots of really good stuff about.
Yeah, the whole thing with Musgrave is this idea of a man who stands for an age that is passing, definitely. And I mean, the other thing in the 1870s is the agricultural depression.
Yes, of course. Yeah,
and a new competition from Germany and from America in the agricultural field. So the
traditional income is
the landed gentry are losing money through that as well. But there's the ancestral nature of Musgrave is beautifully expressed, where you get Holmes describing him. Something of his birthplace seemed to cling to the man, and I never looked at his pale, keen face or the poise of his head without associating him with grey archways and mullioned windows and all the venerable wreckage of a feudal keep.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
But it also it's that phrasing is quite misleading as well, and I think it has led people down the wrong direction. I forget which commentator said that he sees Musgrave as the end of the line because he's described as a bachelor. But what you've got to remember at this point is that Holmes and Musgrave, both men in their 20s.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of time for the Musgrave line to carry on.
Yeah.
I think it's that description that gives the impression of an old man.
Yes.
And then, we'll discuss the Granada adaptation later on, but, he's played as a middle-aged man in that. So you've got to think, I think, of Sidney Paget's dandified portrait of Musgrave in the Strand.
Yes.
To really get an idea of the man. And also that, there is, Holmes says, at university he was something of a dandy. So there is something of the loose city man.
Yes.
About him as well.
Yeah.
But definitely he and his class are beginning to swim against the tide.
Yeah, that's right.
And this story definitely picks up on that aspect.
Yeah, and within it, ultimately, Holmes and Brunton get the better of Musgrave in a sense, and so there is that strong element of meritocracy. The next generation of leaders are going to be people who've earned their way there. And that sort of, you get sense of that coming through this story time and again.
And we're going to get that later with Holmes, because we know he's making an awful lot of money from what he does.
Yes.
So he's, he might still be living in these these lodgings,
Yeah.
but he could probably by the end buy Musgrave out.
Yeah, probably. And the story that Musgrave has to tell Holmes is one that is, designed to intrigue the young detective. Musgrave tells of how two people have gone missing from his house. There's Brunton, this celebrated butler who everybody recognizes as a great intellect. His former lover, Rachel Howells, another domestic servant who he'd recently thrown over for a woman called Tregellis, which is a name that we'll come back to again in The Devil's Foot. She's gone missing too. In the process of dredging the lake to see if she disappeared into the lake, they've found a mysterious package of items. But the whole thing has been triggered by an incident one evening when Musgrave has found Brunton consulting this mysterious catechism, the Musgrave Ritual, one evening. And it was on the basis of that Musgrave had him dismissed from his service after 20 years of service, which just strikes me as being quite harsh. But
it's a bit over the top, considering that this is not something that was. If it was that precious, it would be in a bank vault or something.
Indeed,
it wouldn't just be left in a kind of badly locked drawer in the library.
That's true. That's right. And Holmes immediately spots that there is a connection between these four different component parts of the mystery. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Musgrave Ritual is so popular and significant for Sherlock Holmes fans. And that's because this is the story where you get Holmes's inner workings explained to you almost in real time. Unlike, I think, any other story, even ones narrated by Holmes or narrated to Watson by Holmes, you get almost a step-by-step breakdown of how Holmes approaches the story. So he immediately knows that this linen bag and the missing people are part of the same puzzle. And he's kind of got the end point, maybe not all the end point, but he says, what was the starting point of this chain of events? There lay the end of this tangled line. And then as we go on, we get more insight into Holmes's methods. He talks about, how he tries to put himself in the, imagine himself with the intelligence of the person that he is investigating, and then think about how that person is going to move through the case. And so, unlike almost any other story, I think you get the kind of the step-by-step workings of Sherlock Holmes explained, and that's really appealing. And this is a direct consequence of Watson not being part of the narrative. If Watson was there, then Conan Doyle would keep everything from the reader in the same way as he does in normal stories. But this time round, he can't quite do that. He has to give a bit more of the sort of step-by-step. And it's one of the things that I think is still quite amazing about this story is even with Holmes's inner monologue and explanation of how he goes about working out the story, you still get a mystery. You still get the great reveals throughout the story. He still manages to hide it from you, even though Holmes is essentially telling you step by step what he did.
And then there's that very where you talk about him thinking himself. There's that very revealing comment that he makes. You know my methods in such cases, Watson. I put myself in the man's place, and having first gauged his intelligence, I try to imagine how I should myself have proceeded under the same circumstances. In this case, the matter was simplified by Brunton's intelligence being quite first-rate, so that it was unnecessary to make any allowance for the personal equation, as the astronomers have dubbed it. Therefore, any allowance for the personal equation, Holmes is rating Brunton's intelligence very high because he's rating it close to his own.
Yeah. And in fact, arguably, Brunton's intelligence is greater because Holmes doesn't get the and so under.
Yes.
Actually, Musgrave turns around and says,
for all people.
Hang on, you've forgotten this bit.
Yes.
So, it is a, he is rating him very highly. But it's that kind of, it's the mechanics of how Holmes solves the case that I think that makes this quite an unusual story in that respect.
Yes, definitely. And it works. He is explaining it to Watson of
Yeah.
all people. He's not. It's not a kind of explanation to the reader.
Yeah,
It's an
that's
explanation
right.
to Watson, and that's the key as
Yeah,
well. I think
it is. It is.
and again, Watson is picking this up, and this is where Watson's learning. For his later description of cases.
Yeah.
He's getting from Holmes. This is how I work. This is what I do. And he's paying close attention to it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but there's also, with this, one part of the equation. Holmes can think himself into Brunton's head, but apart from in the equation with Rachel.
Yes.
Because Holmes doesn't understand this stuff himself.
Yeah.
So that's where Brunton is extremely different
Yes.
from Holmes, is with him being the local Lothario and so on. And I think it's also worth mentioning the fact that he's a widower.
Yeah.
And this is where Reggie Musgrave says the problem comes in when he's widowed. That's when he kind of goes off the rails a bit. So you do get the impression of a man who's lived yes, there is this Lothario thing, but is that more? Does that just become more obvious? Once his wife died, because you do get the impression that he really once he's widowed, that's when he starts to go wrong.
Yeah.
And he's going for obviously for the you've got him. He's about 40.
Yeah.
Presumably, Janet Tregellis and Rachel Howells are both younger.
Yeah.
From what we get, so he's chasing younger women as well. So you've got that side to him. So again, that gives him a darker edge.
Yes, it does.
You've got that side that Holmes can admire, but the darker edge, which perhaps Holmes, well, I think he does notice this. Holmes, when talking about Rachel Howells, does actually say that perhaps Brunton had wronged her perhaps far more than we suspected.
Yeah.
And that's a very telling phrase.
Yeah.
That Holmes is reading something into this, that there might be a lot more going on, and this idea maybe Brunton was a bullying.
Yes.
Had a darker edge that we've got to notice, as well as it's easy to admire him because he's putting one over on the master, and he's his intelligence is up there, but his attitude towards women is not of the best.
Yes, and we have and there's a fair amount of that within this story generally. I mean, the Rachel Howells herself is set up to be she's an interesting character because you're never sure if she's innocent victim or villainess in this. She's certainly not the direct agent, but she's described as being of Welsh temperament. She is this fiery woman, What smouldering fire of vengeance had suddenly sprung into flame in this passionate Celtic woman's soul. And we get this quite a lot in Conan Doyle fiction, don't we? About fiery Latin beauties, for example. But here you've got Rachel Howells as being somebody who I think at the end of it, we maybe suspect that she is much more of a wronged woman, as that last quote you've provided, Paul.
I think so, and I think again this is showing, the fact that he's found the treasure, but it's beneath a stone that he can't lift on his own, so he needs to get help. So he turns to Rachel to help him. And again, here's a real chink in Brunton's armor. He really, his psychological understanding is obviously very low. Why he would turn to someone he's wronged, and just shows his arrogance.
Yes.
As well as his lack of psychological insight.
Yeah.
That he's brought her in to help him.
Yeah.
And then, as we know, the stone falls.
The stone falls
and shuts him in. And this is there are, as Holmes said, there are several mysteries, and this is another mystery. Is it did it just fall, or did she knock the proper way? We never know.
We don't know. And the other thing about it is that, to some extent, Holmes is not that interested in this final bit of the puzzle. This is something that Niels Gompert has said in his his writings on Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories, that actually once the intellectual puzzle of the main mystery is resolved, the sort of the puzzle that surrounds people's emotional lives is less of an interest to Sherlock Holmes. He's switched off at that point, and classically you get this here. So Rachel Howells has disappeared. We don't know where. He makes all sorts of suggestions about what might have happened, but actually the conclusion I think he comes to is that she's probably a very wronged woman, but Holmes struggles to get into the mindset, as you say. He struggles to get into the mindset of the woman in this piece.
And I think that there's what you were saying there as well with this the puzzle being the central thing, or the mystery. It brings to mind the second stain, and where he says of Eduardo Lucas's murder that the man's death is just an incident.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that's exactly how he regards Brunton's death. It's just an incident.
Yeah, it is
an unfortunate incident in the case, but it's not. This is not being viewed by Holmes as a case of murder.
Yeah, and when he does try to put himself into the mindset of Rachel Howells, it's more akin to the Gothic influences and inspirations for this story. He says, whatever the case, be what it might. He says, I seem to see that woman's figure still clutching at her treasure trove and flying wildly up the winding stair, with her ears ringing, perhaps with the muffled screams from behind her, and with the drumming of frenzied hands against the slab of stone which was choking her faithless lover's life out. It's amazing. It's great. But something you said right at the beginning, Poe, Cask of Amontillado, this is where it comes in.
And in this case, it's very different, because if she has knocked the proper way, it's hot emotion.
Yeah.
Whereas in the Cask of Amontillado, it's cold emotion. It's revenge. It's this we know there's something gone on between Fortunato and Montresor in that story. We don't know what, and it leads one to brick the other one up alive.
Yeah. Slowly.
And let him come to the realization of what's happening, and then as he finally realizes this isn't a joke.
Yeah.
Yeah, the story ends there. Whereas with this one, if it is a murder, it isn't a cold, calculated, thought through. It's spur of the moment stuff.
Yeah, and you might argue that is a kind of gendering of stories, because you tend to see this kind of women will act out of hot emotion and men will act out of cold. And actually, Conan Doyle's greatest nod to the Cask of Amontillado is almost certainly the new catechism.
Oh yes,
which he would go on to write 5 years later.
Yeah.
We must do that in a future story, because it's a wonderful story.
But both those stories show that again this strong influence of Poe on his work, and not just the direct thing to Cask of Amontillado here, but that general Poe's obsession that we get in the Premature Burial, the Cask of Amontillado, the Fall of the House of Usher, of Premature Burial itself, the idea of premature burial.
Yeah.
If you think too long and hard about this story, it's pretty horrible.
Oh, it is. It really is. And that's one of the things that I think it gets very Gothic very, very quickly. So we've got to the point now where we know Brunton had discovered the treasure, and Rachel Howells escaped with it. She's disappeared, the treasure is recovered, and now there's the question of well what is this kind of this stuff that they've got in front of them? They don't quite know what it is, and that gives us some important insight into the kind of history of the Musgrave family.
Well, it's there. Yeah, with reading the ritual out earlier, most people hearing that will realise it's a treasure hunt.
Yeah.
Of some kind, and it's a trail of clues. Reginald Musgrave doesn't seem to have spotted this at all. To him, it's just this meaningless chant.
Yeah,
that he'll have had to go through when he took over the estate, but it will have just been reading off a piece of paper without recognising the import of the words. You've got to work out where Holmes' main problem is: what does this mean? Leads to the treasure, and then what's the meaning behind this? Who wrote this? And so we then get the history of the slowly begin to unravel what this treasure may be, and it turns out to be a battered old crown. and the whole thing goes back to the English Civil Wars. And it's where we get, and this is again where we get some Conan Doyle personal stuff in. It's Ralph Musgrave, Reginald's ancestor, who accompanied Charles II in his continental wanderings after Charles's defeat at the Battle of Worcester in 1651. But he, for some reason, he's picked out this particular crown and left it at Hurlstone. I mean, one of the other things as a sidetrack on this that's always struck me with this story, it hasn't been particularly well hidden. It's hidden in a cellar underneath a slab with a big lifting ring on it.
Yes, it is.
This isn't hiding it, burying it in the middle of the woods.
No, it isn't.
Kind of thing. So
it isn't.
It's not been thought through, but perhaps that is because, we'll recover it quickly. But just in case we don't, here's this riddle.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately will make sense to no one else.
Yes.
So the whole thing gets forgotten. But as I say, so Ralph Musgrave is a companion of Charles II. So Ralph may have been, or Conan Doyle may have had in mind one of the Westmoreland Musgraves, Sir Philip Musgrave, who actually did fight for Charles I and was a supporter of Charles II in the Civil Wars. He was at the battles of Marston Moor, Rowton Heath, and Worcester, certainly at Worcester. So again, that fits with the character. So Conan Doyle, I think, will have known some of this history and brought it in, and with the definite use of the name Musgrave, and then he's built this whole story,
this mythos
around it. And he obviously knew his stuff on the English Civil Wars, because this is written not too long after Micah Clarke.
Yeah.
So you've got that coming. It's probably some of his research. He might have looked into the Musgraves and their part. When he was doing research for Micah Clarke, it might have been a path he went down at that point. I think the two kind of cross over in a strange way, because with the English Civil Wars, there was an element of class warfare. Going on within those wars. I mean, it wasn't a central thing. This was actually it was a war of gentlemen against gentlemen.
Yes.
But it's because of the chaos. The phrase of the time, the world turned upside down. A lot of Bruntons of that era really did come to the fore. And what's interesting with Micah Clarke is the son of Joseph Clarke, who was one of Oliver Cromwell's Ironsides regiment, very disciplined, one of the best regiments in the Civil War. And Joseph Clarke started out as a trooper and then gets promoted to cornet.
Yes.
So you've got that class element coming in Micah Clarke, and it fits in. This all fits in with a very famous comment that Cromwell himself made in a letter to the Suffolk County Committee in August 1643. Where he says of his regiment, "I had rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows, than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else."
Yeah.
And you've got that element going on in this story as well. So I think that's why the English Civil War side fits in very nicely. This is a class story.
It's a good spot.
It really it's a central theme.
Yeah, it's a good spot, that actually, and I mean, even when you're getting into the Commonwealth, you've got the fact that a lot of the kind of rank and file drive more of the political extremism in the period immediately after the second English Civil War and into the Commonwealth as well, and ultimately is propped up by military force, which is backed up by the views of the rank and file. It's an interesting period of British history to look at. Going back to the actual treasure itself, I mean, there's been quite a lot of debate as to whose crown this is. And you instantly, and I do too as well, latch onto the Battle of Worcester. I mean, some people have sort of said, well, it can't be Charles I's crown, which was the Tudor crown, because that was melted down by Parliament. And sold off. It can't be the St. Edward's crown, which was the traditional one for coronations, because that too was melted down and sold off as well. But, monarchs typically had their own sort of, day-to-day wear of crowns too. But I like the idea that it is Charles II's, and that it's one that he might have had. And was wearing or was intending after the Battle of Worcester, which famously went very badly for him, and he then spent six weeks trawling the country. Andrew Edwards on social media said that he wanted us to talk a bit about this period after the Battle of Worcester as well, because it is a fascinating period that Charles II essentially spends 6 weeks on the run. Famously hides up an oak tree. Very symbolic in this story as well.
Gives a name to half the pubs in England.
Indeed. And then he goes around the country disguised as peasants, servants, using a variety of regional accents.
Yes, you wonder how convincing this might have been.
Yeah, I'm not sure how good his Scouse was, or his West Midlands. But there is the interesting thing that he leaves for France from Shoreham. And Shoreham is not that far from West Sussex. So a lot of the commentators have said, well, maybe this is the thing. He drops by Hurlstone and leaves the stuff there and then heads off to France and obviously returns 9 years later.
It all fits very nicely. And again, now with Conan Doyle, because he was on top of his study with this kind of subject. So it might just be one of those things that just fits nicely by accident. Yeah. It all comes together. I mean, I do tend to think the Sussex location is simply to move away from where his mother's living.
Yeah, I think that's
but the name Musgrave, it's a great name. So he dockets it.
Yes, I think that's right. Right. I mean, the one of the big mysteries of this story is why on earth the Musgraves end up being allowed to keep the crown.
It's one of the things that kind of doesn't make sense, because this isn't just ordinary treasure hoard.
No,
this is part of the state regalia, presumably.
Yeah,
in one way, and so it doesn't convince. I think Reginald would have got a sum of money, as compensation for finding this.
Yes,
and presumably Holmes as well. But it would be taken into government hands, I'm quite sure.
Yes, I think so too. And maybe Holmes is just covering the fact that he got a nice fee from it, and that's what allowed him to set up a bit more permanently in practice. So
I'm surprised it doesn't end up in a drawer in Baker Street.
Well, that's right. Yeah, with a blue carbuncle and something else. Yeah.
Oh yeah, with the crown itself, I sometimes maybe we're reading a bit much into it to try and connect it to an actual crown, because the point of this is it's just a crown.
Yeah, that's right.
It's the object that is behind this, to connect it to the Stuarts in one way and the royal line, and it's just it just serves a purpose. And I don't think, because he'll have known about the melting down of so much of the regalia at the end, that the one it is most like, the crown of Edward the Confessor, definitely went into the melting pot.
Yeah.
So it's I don't think we're meant to think about
it's not meant to. Well, no, not with any of this stuff. We're never meant to think about it as much as we do. No, never. It should be said that some of the loose ends that we've talked about in this story, the nature of the crown and and what happens to Rachel Howells, is actually very well dealt with in the Granada adaptation from 1986, which was in the sort of second batch of 13, the one with Edward Hardwicke. It's such an important and really very, very good adaptation by Jeremy Paul, who won the Edgar for it. It's so influential that, even in the course of writing, our notes to prepare for this story, we found ourselves kind of going, well, hang on, is that in the story, or is that actually in the Granada adaptation? Because Granada did such a good job of it. I mean, they do make some significant changes, but in terms of the big things that we've just talked about there, it is very explicit that the crown of England was auctioned off, that it had been bought by a royalist, and that the royalist had deposited it at Hurlstone. So that's how they get around that. But more importantly, I think it's the wonderful way in which they deal with the Rachel Howells story. I like the fact that they stay faithful to the story, in the sense that Holmes doesn't really know what happens to Rachel Howells. He's leaving in the carriage with Watson at the end. And then the sort of credits, the scene immediately after, which goes into the credits, is that I think it's Tregellis discovers the body of Rachel Howells washes up in the lake. It's really, really well done, but it's a very skillful adaptation. They famously had a lot of problems with it. Michael Cox and John Hawksworth had both listed the Musgrave Ritual as one of the stories they wanted to do in the first 13, but they kept knocking it back and saying we'll do that later because they couldn't decide how to deal with the fact that there was no Watson in it. And this was a question that was raised on Facebook by Captain Basil, taking some time away from the East End of London to comment on a post on Facebook. And Granada were thinking about really deeply about this. Do we actually cast a younger actor? Do we go that far? Do we have a second Sherlock Holmes in the series, or do we go back and write Watson in and don't have any of the backstory at all? In the end, it's a very elegant script. I mean, they even managed to do the kind of box of cases, don't they? Because Holmes and Watson are on the carriage going to the hall, and Holmes says, "Well, I'm planning to get a bit of filing done," which of course allows you.
I think is it allowing Watson to go off and indulge in sport.
Yes.
And then Watson and Holmes can then just stay in the library or whatever and just deal with his archive. So it is very, very cleverly done. It does confuse, as I mentioned earlier, to the extent that you get a more mature Holmes and a more mature Musgrave.
Yes.
Which then, when you've seen that, you forget in the story that these are meant to be young men in their 20s.
Yeah.
So that's the problem with it being so good. It does confuse.
It does. And then there is an altogether more recherche version of the Musgrave Ritual. Sherlock Holmes Faces Death from 1943, which takes the unusual step of obviously updating it to the 1940s, changing it to a convalescent home for, I think it's the Northumberland Fusiliers, isn't it?
I think it's just a general army, because one of them's bomb disposal, isn't he?
Yeah.
So sorry.
That's right. And this time the Musgrave Ritual is rewritten as a code for a chess game, which is very delightful. But should we do it? Should we do the?
Yes, it's very different from the Conan Doyle version.
Very different. Here we go. Who first shall find it were better dead.
Who next shall find it perils his head.
The last to find it defies dark powers.
And brings good fortune to Hurlstone towers.
Where was the light?
On the face of the messenger.
Where did he speed?
To guard the Queen's page.
What foeman advanced?
The Bishop's page rashly.
And who to repel?
The King's cautious page.
What then the disaster?
Page slaughters page.
Who came then to slay him?
The bloodthirsty Bishop.
Where shall he go?
Deep down below.
Away from the thunder.
Let him dig under.
Oh, my Lord.
I don't think T.S. Eliot would have been borrowing from that one.
I love the scene where Holmes says something like, Queen, Bishop, King, Page. And Watson goes, my goodness, it's a chess game. Actually, it is a really fun film, though. This one.
Oh, it's very well done. I mean, it's Bertram Milhauser did the script, and he does within the limitations of the material, he does write some pretty literate stuff. I mean, I'm not sure about the dialogue. There's some fantastic dialogue in this, and it is also quite cleverly done. I mean, one of the lines that we read out there, Page slaughters Page.
Yeah.
Sally Musgrave, played by Hilary Brooke, she slips up when she's reading the ritual and says, Queen slaughters Page. And Brunton, played by the wonderful Halliwell Hobbs.
Oh, yes.
So, no, Miss Sally, I think you'll find it's Page slaughters Page, therefore giving away the fact that he knows.
He knows. That's right.
And so it's lovely little touches in there. And also, what they've done with this is the Musgraves are restored to the north.
Yes, they are.
So it's set in Northumberland in Musgrave Manor, as it is pronounced throughout,
Yes.
next to the Rat and Raven pub.
Yes, the Rat and Raven.
With its resident raven who's cry. I don't know. Again, Poe is brought back in,
Isn't
but
he?
instead of nevermore, it simply cries blood all the time. Charlie the Raven.
Charlie.
This is great stuff.
And of course, they change it to Musgrave Manor. It's Musgrave Manor, but in the ritual that's described in the film, it's called Hurlstone Towers.
So there's some editorial slip-ups going on.
A few. But it's a great fun film, and in fact, we recently did another podcast. We did went on the Mean Streets podcast, the Film Noir podcast, with Luke Deckard and Matthew Booth to talk about another of the Rathbone Bruce movies, The Woman in Green. So I'll put a link to that when that comes out, which should be out at the end of April, I think. But that was great fun as well.
And I think that was another Bertram Milhouser script.
It was.
As well.
Yeah, it was. And another one that borrowed from other stories, supposedly The Empty House, although there's not a huge amount of empty house, it should be said.
And I just wonder as well, we do know that this story influenced T.S. Eliot. But I also wonder, thinking of the Gothic side to it, whether its influence might be felt by another Sherlock Holmes fan, M.R. James, the great ghost story writer, because we have two stories there: the tractate Mid-Oth, which was published in 1911 in More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, which builds itself around a riddle or a puzzle which has to be solved before an inheritance can be discovered. So I just wonder whether, in the back of his mind, James was having a bit of fun. And also in 1925, one of his most famous stories, A Warning to the Curious, which involves the last remaining East Anglian crown. And that's buried, and its burial protects England. And it is disturbed, and the disturber. There are consequences for disturbing this crown, and that's also that kind of if you think of, was the crown in Hurlstone, if it was Edward the Confessor's, that would have been an Anglo-Saxon crown.
It would,
just as the one in Warning to the Curious. But it's I might be clutching at straws, but knowing that James was a huge Sherlock Holmes fan.
Why not?
Might have been in his mind somewhere.
Why not? Could be deep down.
Deep down under.
no digging.
Exactly.
So that brings us to the end of this episode. If you want to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And please follow us on social media, where we are at Doings of Doyle. And next time we've got an interview guest joining us, Paul.
Yes, hopefully we should be talking to Andrew Finkel, who is an expert on Turkish history and current affairs. And he became intrigued by the idea that Sultan Abdulhamid II loved the Sherlock Holmes stories and has built a Sherlock Holmes story around that.
Yeah. So we'll be talking to Andrew about the adventure of the second wife on the next episode. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. It's Brunton who is driving he's the one who's worked out the ritual. He's the one who's got to the treasure that is hidden in Musgrave Manor. But I've just
you're in the wrong place. We'll be discussing that later.
You drunken sot. The master's been ringing you for the past 10 minutes. Why don't you answer it?
Fly away, little gremlin.